The street was quiet, the kind of quiet that wraps around you after a long journey, after hours on a plane, hours at the airport, hours telling yourself that everything back home is exactly the way you left it. The sun was setting low, painting the sky that deep, burnt orange color you only seem to notice when you've been away too long and your eyes are hungry for something familiar. A black SUV rolled slowly down the road and came to a stop in front of a freshly painted duplex. The gate was wide open, and from inside that compound came music. Not soft, background music. Loud, joyful, the kind of music that spills out into the street and pulls strangers in. Celebratory, the kind that announces something important is happening inside. Something that someone clearly forgot to tell one particular person about. A man stepped out of the car, tired eyes, a travel bag hanging from one shoulder, dust still sitting on the toes of his shoes from the airport floor miles behind him. He stood at the entrance of the compound he had paid for, brick by brick, from thousands of miles away. And then he saw it. Chairs arranged in perfect rows. White and gold decorations draped across the walls he had chosen the color for. Flowers lining a makeshift aisle through the yard he had designed himself. Guests dressed in their finest, laughing, eating, caught up in the warmth of celebration. And standing at the front of it all, at what looked unmistakably like an altar, was a woman in a white dress. Her back was to him. Her hair was pinned up the way she had always described she would wear it on her wedding day. His fiancée, Celine, the woman whose photograph had sat on his nightstand in a cold apartment in Germany for 3 long years. She was holding hands with someone, a man in a dark suit, broad shoulders, a familiar way of standing that Robert recognized before he even saw the face. His eyes moved slowly to that man's profile, and the travel bag slipped from his hand and hit the ground. Because standing at that altar, beside the woman Robert loved, was David, his best friend, the man who had helped him pour the very foundation of that house. Robert's lips parted. His hands trembled at his sides, and in barely more than a whisper, the words came out of him like something broken. What did I just walk into? Stay right here. Don't click away, because this story is about to go somewhere you are not ready for. And if you have ever trusted someone with everything, your money, your future, your heart, then what you are about to hear is going to hit you somewhere deep. If this is your first time on this channel, welcome. We tell real, raw, emotional stories that make you stop and think, that make you look at the people closest to you a little differently. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications so you never miss a story. Like this video if you're already feeling something in your chest. And drop your location in the comments. Let us know where in the world you're watching from tonight. Now let's go back to the beginning. Because to understand the man standing frozen at that gate, you need to understand who Robert was before this moment tore his world apart. Robert grew up in a neighborhood where ambition was either your greatest tool or your heaviest burden. The kind of place where people had big dreams and loud mouths, but the road narrowed quickly and most people found themselves standing still before they ever built any real momentum. He was the second of 3 children. His father worked long shifts at a printing company. His mother sold fabric at the weekend market, folding and refolding the same bolts of cloth with hands that never quite stopped moving. They were not poor in spirit, not even close, but they were stretched thin in every practical way. And Robert watched all of that growing up. He watched his father come home with sore feet and still find the energy to ask, "Did you study today?" He watched his mother count out money at the kitchen table after the rest of the house had gone quiet, her lips moving slightly as if she were praying over the numbers. And somewhere in those long, ordinary, aching evenings, Robert made himself a promise. He was going to build something solid, something that meant the counting could finally stop. He was not the loudest person in any room he walked into, He was the kind of man who listened more than he spoke, who showed up early and stayed late, who said he would do something and then did it, even when it cost him. His family relied on him for it. His friends liked him for it. And Celine fell in love with him for it. They met through a mutual friend at a birthday gathering, the casual, ordinary kind of meeting that you never think will change the direction of your life until it already has. He noticed her first. She was standing near a window, not performing for anyone, just watching the room with this quiet, self-contained expression like she was the only person there who wasn't trying to impress someone. He walked over and said something small, something he couldn't even remember afterward, but she laughed, genuinely, unselfconsciously, and that was the moment. He knew in the way you sometimes just know. They dated for 2 years before he proposed. No grand production, no staged moment designed for photographs. Just the two of them on the rooftop of her sister's apartment one evening. The city spread out and humming below them, and Robert on one knee saying, "I don't have everything yet, but I'm going to, and I want you standing next to me when I do." She said yes before he had fully finished the sentence. The opportunity came the way most life-changing things do, through a connection of a connection, a rumor that became a lead that became a phone call that became a contract. A labor position in Germany. 3 years. Decent wages. Enough to save seriously, enough to build, enough to come home with something real in his hands instead of just promises. It was not glamorous work. He would be in a logistics warehouse outside Frankfurt. Long physical shifts, repetitive labor, nothing that matched the degree he had spent years working toward. But Robert did not see it that way. He saw a door, and he understood that sometimes the door that opens is not the one you would have chosen, but you walk through it anyway because the alternative is standing still. Before he left, he and Celine sat together for a long, slow evening going through everything. The wedding they'd planned for his return, the neighborhood they had already identified, the children they talked about quietly and carefully the way people do when something feels too precious to speak too loudly. And the house. Robert had already found the land. Already spoken with an architect. Already filled the back of an envelope with sketches and measurements and small handwritten notes to himself. A duplex, one side for the two of them, one side to rent out. He had watched his parents live paycheck to paycheck, and he had decided, firmly and finally, that his children would never know that particular wait. 2 years, he told Celine that night, though they both knew the contract said 3. "I'll send everything I earn. Everything." She held his face in both her hands and looked at him for a long moment before she spoke. "Just come back to me," she said. That was all. And then there was David. David had been Robert's closest friend since they were young men making noise in the same classrooms and getting into the same low-stakes trouble. They were different in almost every measurable way. Robert quiet and methodical, David quick-talking and magnetic, but the differences worked. They balanced each other in the way that only real friendships do, the kind that are so old you can't remember a version of yourself that didn't include the other person. They had been through real things together. Job losses, family grief, moments of financial embarrassment that strip away the performance and show you who someone actually is when the lights go down. Every one of those moments had brought them closer, or so Robert had believed. The night before he flew out, Robert sat across from David over drinks and laid everything out on the table: the land, the building plan, the construction budget, the contact details for the crew, the name of the foreman to call if anything went sideways. He pushed a notebook across the table, every detail written in his careful, precise handwriting. "I need you to be my eyes on the ground," Robert said. "You're the only person I trust with this." David looked at the notebook, then looked at Robert, and clapped him once on the shoulder. "Brother," he said, "your house will be finished before you're ready to come home." They laughed. They embraced at the door. And Robert boarded that plane with his heart full of something that felt, at the time, very much like certainty. The cold was the first thing Germany taught him. Frankfurt in winter is not something you can prepare for by reading about it. It lives in your bones, in the gap between your collar and your jaw, in the walk between the bus stop and the warehouse door every morning before the sun has fully decided to rise. He shared a small apartment with two other men from back home. A cramped space that always smelled of boiled rice and damp coats hung over radiators that only half worked. But Robert did not complain. He worked. He saved. Every single month, without exception, he made 2 transfers. A smaller one to Celine for her living expenses and wedding preparations, and a larger one into the construction account he had set up for David to oversee. He sent voice notes to Celine most evenings. He called David every other week for progress reports on the build. In the first year, everything felt exactly as it should. Celine would send him photographs. The foundation going in, the walls beginning to rise, small moments of progress that he would zoom in on and stare at in the blue light of his phone screen after a long shift. David would joke on their calls, "Your house is going to be the finest one on that street, brother. I'm telling you." And Robert would laugh from across the world and feel, despite the cold and the exhaustion and the loneliness, that all of it was worth it. The second year was when the first cracks appeared. Not in the house, in everything else. Celine's calls grew shorter, flatter, more difficult to hold up from both ends. She started saying she was tired, or busy, or just not feeling like talking. He told himself it was the distance doing what distance does, wearing down the connection the way water wears down stone, slowly, invisibly, until you look one day and notice the shape has changed. He pushed back against it the only way he could from that far away. Longer voice messages, a surprise gift arranged through a friend back home, handwritten letters that took 2 weeks to arrive. But the warmth between them felt increasingly like something being rationed, like she was giving him only what she could spare rather than what she actually felt. By the middle of the second year, he was sometimes going an entire week without hearing her voice. And David had grown vague in a way that Robert kept telling himself was just David being David, always a little scattered, always more confident than organized. "Construction is moving, don't stress yourself," David would say. But the photographs stopped coming. The specific updates stopped. Whenever Robert pressed for detail, the answer drifted. "Trust me, brother. I have it handled." And because it was David, because of the notebook and the shoulder clap and 20 years of history, Robert kept telling himself to trust. That was the decision he would spend a long time turning over in his mind afterward. It was a Thursday evening in late autumn when everything shifted. He had just finished a double shift. He was sitting on the edge of his bed in that small apartment, pulling off his work boots, too depleted even to think about eating. He picked up his phone the way you do when your hands need something to do while your mind winds down, and opened his messages. There was one from a number he had never seen before. No name, no context, no greeting, just a single line of text. "Come home. Something is wrong." He read it 3 times. He typed back immediately, "Who is this?" and waited. No reply came. He called the number. It rang out. He called again. Same result. He sat there in the quiet of that apartment, his roommates asleep, the city outside moving through its nighttime routines, and felt something travel through him that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. He called Celine. She did not pick up. He called David. Same silence. He told himself there was a reasonable explanation for all of it. He even managed to sleep. But when he woke up, the feeling was still sitting in his chest, heavier, sharper, and it did not move all day or the day after that. He booked a flight home 4 days later. He told no one. Not Celine, not David, not even his mother. He framed it to himself as a surprise. He would arrive, find everything in order, feel embarrassed for having worried, and spend a good week laughing with the people he loved. He held on to that version of events all the way through check-in, all the way through the long flight and the layover and the final descent, all the way through customs and the familiar chaos of the arrivals hall and the taxi ride through streets he recognized like his own handwriting. He held on to it right up until the moment that black SUV turned the corner onto his street and the sound of celebration music drifted out through an open gate. And then he let go of it, because what was in front of him was real, and it was not the story he had been telling himself at all. If you are feeling the weight of this right now, you are exactly where this story wants you. Go ahead and like this video. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who need to hear stories like this one. And drop a comment telling us honestly, did you see any of this coming? Or are you sitting there right now the same way Robert was standing at that gate? Keep watching, because we haven't reached the hardest part yet. Robert walked through that gate the way a man walks into a place he used to know. Certain and lost at the same time. The house was finished. That was the first thing his mind registered, clearly separate from everything else. The duplex he had sketched on an envelope, that he had paid for with 3 years of 6-day weeks and meals he ate standing up because he didn't have the energy to sit down. It was standing there in front of him, complete. Fresh paint on the exterior walls. A tiled front porch. The mango tree he had specifically asked the construction crew to work around was still standing in the far corner of the yard, exactly where it had always been. Under any other circumstances, this would have been the proudest moment of his adult life. Instead, it felt like something solid pressing slowly against his ribs. The guests closest to the gate began to notice him first. A whisper here, a sharp glance there. Someone set down a glass too quickly. The murmuring moved through the gathered crowd like a ripple moving outward from a single point, quiet but fast, spreading from row to row until it reached the front of the yard. Until it reached her. Celine turned. And across that decorated compound, across the rows of white and gold chairs, across 3 years and an ocean and 100 unanswered questions. Their eyes met. The expression that crossed her face was not the one Robert had been unconsciously preparing himself for during the entire flight home. He had anticipated guilt or panic, or the particular expression of someone caught doing something they knew was wrong. What he saw instead was something he hadn't expected and didn't know what to do with. Shock. Yes, the shock was there, but underneath it was something that looked more like grief. Like she had already put this version of the story somewhere she thought was permanent, and seeing him standing there had reached in and pulled it back out. David turned a moment later, and unlike Celine, his face went very still. Too still. The specific stillness of a man who is not surprised. Who is doing math very quickly in his head about what comes next. The music kept going for a few more absurd seconds before someone found the source and cut it. In the silence that followed, Robert stood in the middle of everything he had worked for, looked at the 2 people he had trusted most in his adult life, and said quietly, "Explain this." 2 words, but they carried the full weight of every wire transfer, every lonely Thursday, every voice note recorded in a cold apartment while the rest of the world slept. Celine took 1 step toward him. David placed his hand lightly on her arm. That gesture, that casual, proprietorial touch, was the thing that nearly undid Robert completely. He looked at David's hand on her arm, and he breathed, and he held himself very still. David stepped forward first, and the way he moved, unhurried, almost relaxed, confirmed what Robert had already started to understand. This man had thought about this moment, had decided ahead of time how he would carry himself through it. "Robert," he said, just the name, as if that were enough. Robert held his gaze and said nothing. He looked past David at Celine. Let her speak. Celine's eyes were filling. She pulled herself gently away from David's hand. A small movement, but Robert noticed it. And when she finally spoke, her voice had the texture of someone who had been quietly falling apart for a long time and had only recently begun to hold herself together again. "Robert, I thought you were gone." He kept his voice level. "I was in Germany. You knew exactly where I was." I knew where you were, she said. But everything else stopped. The money stopped. Your calls stopped. For months, Robert, months went by with nothing. His jaw tightened. That is not what happened. It is what I lived, she said, and there was no anger in it. That was the disorienting part. She was not attacking him. She was describing her experience. And Robert, beneath the disbelief and the anger, felt the first cold tremor of something worse. Confusion. Because he had sent the money. Every month. He had the records saved on his phone. In his email, printed and filed in a folder, he kept in the drawer of his nightstand in Frankfurt like the careful, organized man he had always been. So where had it gone? His eyes moved to David. And David, to whatever credit or shame belongs to a man in that moment, did not look away. Robert asked him one question. How much do you know? David was quiet for long enough that the silence became its own kind of answer. Then he said, enough. And that word, that single, quiet, unbothered word, told Robert everything he needed to know about who had been in control of this situation and for how long. What unfolded over the following hours, as the guests quietly and uncomfortably excused themselves and the yard emptied out and the decorations sat in the heat growing irrelevant, was not a confrontation so much as an excavation. Bank records, phone logs, messages sent from Robert's side that had never reached Celine, and responses from Celine that had been intercepted, reframed, or simply buried. David had been the go-between for everything. He had access to the construction account, to the communication chain, to Celine's daily reality in a way that Robert, from across the world, could not compete with. He had been diverting portions of the money from the start. Small amounts initially, then more, covered with construction delays and vague updates and a confident voice that never invited scrutiny. And to Celine, he had been feeding a different story entirely. That the transfers had stopped. That Robert had grown cold and distant. That sources he was always careful not to name specifically had suggested Robert had found a life in Germany that didn't include her anymore. He planted doubt the way you plant anything, a little at a time, in soil you've already prepared. And then he watered it by being present. Reliable. There. He showed up when she was scared. He answered when she called. He offered comfort when she was convinced she was being left behind. And Celine, who was human and exhausted and alone and receiving nothing that she could trace back to Robert, slowly turned toward the warmth that was in front of her. It was not a sudden thing. It never is. Now I want you to pause with me here for just a moment. Because it is very easy, to look at Celine from the outside and say she should have known. That she should have fought harder, trusted deeper, held on longer. But I want you to be honest with yourself. If the person you loved went quiet for months, if the money stopped coming, if message after message seemed to disappear into silence, if the one person physically present in your life kept telling you, gently and consistently, that it was over, what would you have believed? What would you have done? I am not asking you to excuse anything. I am asking you to understand it. Because understanding is the only thing that leads anywhere worth going. Tell us in the comments what you think Celine should have done. We genuinely want to know what you think. The wedding was never finished. The officiant had packed his things and slipped away quietly sometime during the hour that followed. The few remaining guests stood in small groups near the edges of the yard, not sure whether leaving would be rude and not sure whether staying was appropriate, speaking in low voices with eyes that kept returning to the three people at the center of it all. Robert stood in the compound. His compound, every wall of it paid for by his hands and his time and his sacrifice, and looked at David for a long, still moment. There are points in life when you can feel the weight of a decision before you make it. When you understand, even in the moment, that what you choose to do next is going to say something about you that will outlast the pain of what just happened to you. Robert felt that weight. And what moved through him in those long seconds was not the hot, obvious rage he might have predicted in himself. It had passed through that and come out somewhere colder and cleaner. A grief that had finished burning and left something harder behind. He turned to Celine. "I'm sorry," he said. And the words were so unexpected in that context that she physically flinched. "I'm sorry that someone used your pain as a tool to take apart what we were building. I'm sorry that I couldn't reach you from where I was. I'm sorry that the man I trusted most became the reason we are standing here like this." Tears ran down her face and she didn't try to stop them. He looked at David last. And what he said was quiet enough that only the three of them caught it. "I built this house thinking I was building a home. I see now I was just building something for you to stand in." He bent down, picked up the travel bag that had fallen near the gate when all of this began, slung it back over his shoulder, and walked out through the same gate he had walked in through. No shouting, no scene, no final dramatic gesture, just a man leaving with his name still intact. In the days that followed, the truth moved the way truth always does once it starts. Faster and further than the lie that kept it quiet. David's manipulation had not been as invisible as he believed. There were records. There were receipts. There were people who had noticed things over the months and said nothing, waiting to see how it resolved, and who now spoke. His reputation, the social standing he had traded Robert's trust to protect and expand, collapsed with a speed that surprised even those who had suspected something was off. Friends stopped returning his messages. His family was visibly embarrassed by the whole situation. He tried briefly to reframe it, to present what he had done as something that had simply unfolded rather than something he had built piece by deliberate piece over months. Nobody accepted that framing. He moved out of the neighborhood within 2 months. He went quietly and nobody followed. Celine was left in a different kind of wreckage. She had not been calculating. She had been lied to, and she had made choices based on those lies that she would carry with her. She reached out to Robert twice in the weeks that followed. The first message he didn't respond to. The second time he replied with 4 words, "I forgive you. Take care." Not an invitation back. Not a door reopening. Just a man releasing something he refused to carry, because he understood that carrying it would only weigh him down on the road ahead. Robert stayed in the house. He had built it and paid for it, and he was not going to let shame drive him out of something that was rightfully his. He rented out the second unit of the duplex to a quiet young family, the rental income providing exactly the financial cushion he had always planned for. He took a few weeks to simply be still, to sleep in late, to sit in the yard under the mango tree his father would have liked, to call his mother and talk for as long as she wanted without watching the clock. And then, slowly, he started again. Not back to Germany. He had enough now to begin a business locally, something he had been sketching out in his head during those long warehouse shifts in Frankfurt. It was smaller than he had originally imagined. The plans had always included Celine, but he found, as the weeks became months and the business began to find its footing, that building something with your own hands never loses its meaning just because the person you built it for is no longer standing beside you. The work still mattered. The dream still mattered. He still mattered. And Robert was the kind of man who could hold onto that truth even when everything around it had fallen apart. 6 months after that afternoon at the gate, a mutual friend mentioned to Robert, almost in passing, that the person who had sent that anonymous message, "Come home. Something is wrong," had been a woman in the neighborhood. Someone who had watched what David was doing for months, who had no way to say it openly, but who couldn't stay silent either. He never found out exactly who she was. He never went looking. But on the evening he heard it, he sat in the yard of his house as the sun went down and thought about how a stranger's quiet courage had sent him home at exactly the right moment. Not to save what was already broken, but to know the truth. And there is something about knowing the truth, even when it hurts, that sets you free in a way that comfortable lies never can. Now let me ask you something before we close. If you were Robert, if you walked through that gate and saw exactly what he saw, what would you have done in that moment? Would you have made a scene? Would you have broken down? Or would you have found somewhere inside yourself the kind of dignity that he did? And do you believe that some betrayals, as brutal as they are, eventually push us towards something better than what we were holding on to? I genuinely want to know what you think. Drop it in the comments below. There are no wrong answers here, just real ones. And if this story moved you the way we think it did, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Like this video before you go. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next story, because the next one carries a different kind of weight, the kind that will make you call someone you haven't spoken to in too long. Turn on your notifications. And wherever you are watching from tonight, thank you for staying until the end. Robert's story is not just about betrayal. It's about what a person is made of when everything they trusted turns out to be something else entirely. And maybe, if you look honestly at your own life, you'll find a little of Robert in yourself. The part that keeps going. The part that builds. The part that walks away with its dignity when the moment calls for it. That part of you is worth protecting. Don't ever let anyone take it.